Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of our Beyond Stigma series, focusing on Middle Eastern and North African representation in the media, where we delve into discussions surrounding different identities and experiences of those who have worked in the media and the arts and entertainment industries. Today, we are joined by our very special guest, Sahar Zand. Sahar is a British-Iranian multimedia reporter and filmmaker with extensive experience in long-form current affairs and documentaries. Sarah has fronted a range of award-winning stories from across the world for the BBC, Channel 4's Unreported World, and a number of other international broadcasters. Most of Sarah's work has focused on underreported human interest stories, and she strives for high-impact storytelling and has reported on a diverse range of topics from conflict and human rights abuses to gender and mental health issues. She excels in exploring sensitive subjects with empathy, creativity, and journalistic rigour. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much. So for the first question we've been asking our guests, it's a general one, but what made you want to pursue a career in this industry and become a journalist and filmmaker?
Unlike a lot of people who are actually in this industry, I never ever wanted anything to do with journalism. In fact, I found it quite boring. But I guess my life had always, without me realizing, prepared me for this job. And when I did find myself in it, that's when I knew this is what I want to do forever. That's the only thing I want to do. To answer your question, I must start from a few years ago. Well, almost 20 years ago. I was 12 years old in Iran, and one night we wake up to the sound of men in black coming in, taking my father away. And the next day, instead of going to school, my mom said, "You're not going to school, we're going to the airport." The first time in my life I ever got on a plane, we actually flew to a land I had never even heard of. We landed in Denmark, and I spent the next few years of my life living in various refugee camps around Europe with my mom and my baby sister. We were homeless. We were living on the side of the streets at some point. We were living in different refugee camps, like I said, in different hostels, until we eventually ended up here. During this period, I wasn't able to study. I didn't have a life. I didn't belong. And I was amongst a lot of other people who were in the same position. Some of them were from countries that I had never heard from, like various African countries, and some were from countries that I always feared. There were Palestinians, there were Pakistanis, there were Syrians. And as a child from Iran, we had our biases and we were scared of them. And we found ourselves living in the same building as them. We found ourselves sharing the same bathroom, sharing the same kitchen with them, and not even being able to speak the same language. After spending such a long time together, we came to get to know each other. We sat down and found ways to communicate, whether it was through drawings or this language that we developed that was a mixture of Iranian, English, Danish, whatever. We called it camp language. We actually had nothing to do but sit down and listen to each other. And once we did that, all of these biases slowly disappeared. I realized that the man that we feared so much was just a human being who, his environment made him who he is. And the reason I was scared of him had nothing to do with him. It had everything to do with me. But only when I sat down and I spoke to him and I lived with him, the scary man became my uncle. I used to refer to him as my uncle. And that goes with all the other people we were living with, who were initially terrifying, but they became my family. And I remember all those years ago, I thought, wow, only if everybody in the world had this opportunity, only if people were forced to sit down with one another and be forced to put their differences aside and hear each other out, we realize that we have so much more in common than differences. And surely that would make the world a much more loving, better place, less hateful. And I always knew that I wanted to do something with my life that can sort of highlight these similarities and make people listen to each other. But I didn't really know what that was. When we came to the UK, I was around 14, and I was, sent to school. And by the time I learned English, I was already doing my GCSEs. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life. I picked the A levels that basically needed the least level of English, like maths, art, physics. And once I finished my A-levels, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I thought through art, I could make people listen. I could achieve this goal that I set for myself all those years ago. But my family didn't let me. So I ended up having to study architecture, which didn't really resonate with me. I didn't really like it. But it was during the time I was studying architecture that I applied for a set design internship at this Iranian channel that was starting up in London. I was 19 at the time. And after a very short time of working there for free as an intern, they offered me a TV presenting role. At the time, after so many years of being invisible, suddenly being shown, suddenly being on TV, I loved it. And I was like getting messages from loads of people from Afghanistan and Iran telling me how brilliant they thought I was. And I loved it at that time. But then because of various reasons, especially the fact that my university was 6 hours away, I ended up having to leave that job. And I was miserable because initially I thought it's because I'm no longer getting the validation that that job gave me. But once all of that went away, I realized that what I loved about that job so much was because I had a voice, people were listening, and I could use that voice to make a difference. And suddenly I had this light bulb moment at the height of my depression, of being sad about having lost that opportunity. I realized having lost that was a blessing in disguise, because I realized me loving that job so much was not about me, was about this mission I found myself wanting to go on as a 12-year-old kid in a refugee camp. And I decided that I'm going to finish my education, but I'm going to do nothing but to get into broadcast journalism. I remember I used to skip my own lectures. I used to go to other lectures about media, and I used to learn how documentaries work. I bought myself I had like zero money. I went into debt and bought myself the secondhand camera, taught myself how to film, how to edit. I started writing for the university's newspaper. And as soon as I graduated, I did not apply for a single architecture job. I applied for any job, working for free, doing anything, doing runner work, doing everything I could in any TV station you can imagine that were available to me. And being in that environment, I had to learn journalism from scratch. And it was so difficult, but it was worth it. And I kept persisting, and I stuck with my goal. And I am so glad that, excuse me, I'm so glad that despite all the difficulties, I stuck to it, and am now in a position to be able to make my dream, the dream of 12-year-old me, a refugee kid, desperate to show the world what she had learned back then. I'm so happy that I'm in a position to be able to do that now.
That's such an inspirational story. It's something that, I've come across these stories obviously in print and then on sometimes in TVs and movies, but you never really come across a person like real on face to face that has a background like that. And it's such an inspirational, journey that you've taken from a refugee camp to being, such a successful journalist now.
Thank you very much. I mean, I really appreciate your kind words, but I must say something. I'm not special at all. And what happened to me wasn't special. We all go through different difficulties growing up, and how difficult they are actually relative. We all feel difficulties, sadness, bad emotions the same way. And just because my situation seems quite extreme doesn't mean it felt any worse than somebody else in a different position. But I think what my experience really taught me is that whatever happens to us in life is actually preparing us for our final goal. And if we actually listen and reflect on what we've been through, and instead of fighting it, instead of hating the ugly situations that we were stuck in, if we actually reflect and see what we learned from them and who they made us, and stay true to that person, I think that's those difficulties are a blessing in disguise, because they give us a purpose. They teach us about who we are. because no one really learns about who they are or what they want to do in happiness. We're distracted being happy and, enjoying life. But it's when we're going through the most difficult times that we actually grow, that we actually learn about who we are and where we want to go.
I think a lot of people, especially during this pandemic, need to hear words like that. So there's a lot of wisdom behind what you've just said. And it's something that we all kind of need to remind ourselves, even if we do know that, And so, no, thank you for that. I just wanted to ask, so the projects that you've worked on quite recently, in Afghanistan and abroad in a lot of countries. So most of us, here in a Western country like the UK, if we do become journalists, are either born and brought up here, and then we go to these different scenarios. But you've had that experience of coming out of being a refugee, and then now you're going back and seeing people that are in a similar circumstance to what you experienced. Does that allow you to relate to the people that you're talking to in a better way, or how has it benefited you or not benefited you in your career?
What I do is obviously difficult and dangerous. I mean, I'm going to war zones, I'm going to a lot of hostile environments, to countries where if I'm caught recording a film about their situations, I could end up in jail or, worse. And because of my journalism activities, I can never go back to Iran. If I go back, I can never come back out. So I've had to sacrifice a lot. And, I do get asked, is it worth it? And what I say to that is absolutely it's worth it. Because whenever I'm going to a country risking my life to sit down with a mother who's just lost her baby, to sit down with a kid who has to work on the streets selling things just because he can't go to school or he has to help support his family. Every time I meet all of these unfortunate people, sit down, listen to their stories, show them that they're not invisible, that I care, that the world cares, and help have their stories heard, I feel like I'm contributing. I feel like I'm going back in time, holding the hand of like that little Sahar that was invisible, that was poor, that was hopeless. And I'm holding her hand and I'm telling her it's okay. People care. It does get better. And that's a feeling that I can never, ever change for anything. If you come and tell me right now that I can have a job that offers me safety, security, money, comfort, I wouldn't want that. What I get to do is so amazing, and I'm so lucky to be in a position to be able to feel this way about what I do. And a lot of the time, sometimes it might seem a bit over ambitious or arrogant to say that, yes, I'm telling people stories and making the world a better place. Maybe not so, but that's my way. I feel like that's me playing my part based on my abilities, based on my experiences, to be able to at least contribute to the mess that this world is. And if I can at least touch one person's heart by being the device between those who are invisible and those who are watching, if I actually can have one person feel something, then I've done my job.
I mean, that's so amazing. And it just also shows the power of media and journalism and how many people you can give this information to by doing the projects that you do. And actually, I was going to ask you, so, you've done so many different projects, like Misbah was saying, focusing on different cultures and different countries. You've touched on really specific topics that are just so fascinating and very bold, like you said, it's not, you do very challenging things that can be sometimes dangerous, like people can see that it can put you at risk as well. But, you're so passionate about it that it's amazing. But, with the projects that you do, they all revolve around, very sensitive subjects and culture. And, back when you were just saying when you first came to the UK and you were forced to talk to other people and live with these people that you had never come across, do you think that experience led you to want to work on these sorts of projects and focus on different cultures and experiences?
Yes, my past experiences of being able to sit down with people and being forced initially to sit down with them, hearing their stories and realizing that past our superficial differences, we're actually very similar and we're all human, and we only feel like we're different because of external factors. and the experiences that make us who we are. Apart from that, which I definitely bring into my work, and which is something that I'm so grateful I managed to learn as such a young kid, as well as that, once I did get into journalism, and the more research I do around the topic, and the more problems I see, and the more I learned about the power of journalism, that also continued to inspire me and encourage me to keep going. And even though my passion started from the camps of Denmark 20 years ago as a stateless, homeless kid, now as a journalist, the more I do stories, I'm now getting inspired to do more, because I'm seeing the effect it has on the world, because I'm seeing that people are hearing the people's stories, because I'm actually going to places and meeting with so many people who are feeling helpless, who are in such dire positions, and knowing how many stories, how many people, how many individuals like that there are. That's what gets me going, because it's so easy to forget how unjust the world is, and how that the scale of devastation and bad things that's happening outside of our bubble. We're always looking inwards as human beings. And once you're put in a position where you see people living so differently to what you know, with pain so much bigger than you can even imagine, then you can't stop. Then you've been exposed to that, and you can no longer ignore what you've seen. And it's those stories that helps me and encourages me to keep going.
That's very inspirational again.
You guys are so nice. Whatever I say,
I'm just like
with me.
You do know you have me in awe. It's very motivational as well. It's you're
like
right.
A motivational speaker.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, no, it's just even through our own work, it's like you do forget, like whilst you're living in the UK, especially, about how much there is out there, and how much how many people are in such dire situations, and because we're so comfortable, we forget that these things actually exist outside of our TV screens, and they're realities for people. So you've mentioned you're based in the UK. Your origin is Iran. You're obviously working through the UK, British journalism and that industry. And so how has that been as a person that is not, British in the sense of what may be stereotypically British, in a community that is dominated by a certain demographic? What has it been like, and how has it affected your journey?
That's a hard question, because when you're going somewhere, for example, when you're driving from A to Z, you're just thinking about the final place you get to, and along the way there will be traffic, there will be so many different obstacles, but you'll eventually get there. And once you get there, you know what you've been through, but that's all you know. And it's hard to say, oh, I could have gotten here faster had I not taken that route, or had there not been those external factors that I couldn't control. So it's hard to answer that. But to give you a more abstract and honest answer, my grandmother was Russian, my other grandmother was Kurdish, one of my granddads was Afghan. I was born in Iran, but then we traveled around Iran because of my dad's job at the time. He was a civil engineer. And, I left when I was at this crucial age where I was just like discovering who I am. Oh, I am me. There is a me. And we lived in so many different countries, in so many random conditions. So I genuinely, definitely have a bit of an identity issue. I don't actually, when I'm amongst Iranians, they don't consider me as fully Iranian. I have a bit of an accent. When I'm around English people, I'm not quite English because I have a bit of an accent. There is this background culture. So I've never found a place where I've fitted. And this is sometimes a bad thing, because you feel lonely, you feel isolated, you feel like you don't belong. But at times it's also very freeing. It's nice not to be put in a box. You're free to be yourself. And sometimes when you don't feel like you're not restricted by certain social constructs, you are more free to be yourself, and you forgive yourself more for not being perfect, because none of us are. We're full of flaws, but we try so hard to be perfect, as if there is such thing. However, as a woman of color with a bit of an accent and the background that I had, especially class, we grew up, because of our background, we grew up with very little money. I did face a lot of issues entering the industry, but I wasn't prepared to let that hold me back. You never hear people's biases, but after a while, you're like, either I'm not good, or there may be biases, And the more I persisted in the industry and made the films I made, I realized, okay, maybe I'm not perfect. Nobody is. But then it wasn't me then. So there were times where I did face discrimination like this, but I chose to not focus on whether or not I was being discriminated against, whether or not I chose to ignore it, because my time and my energy is scarce. All of our time and energy is scarce. And if I was to focus on the obstacles that I have no control over, I would have, I would have given up. I wouldn't have had enough time to keep persisting. So, I mean, when you go to, when you hear the NA or AA prayers, they say, God, give me I don't really know it, but they basically say, help me accept the things I cannot change and help me change the things I can, which is, ourselves. So I changed myself and I decided, okay, these biases may or may not exist. They do, but I am going to actually use my differences and use my diverse background to my advantage. I'm no longer going to go into an interview or in front of the TV or to a commissioner and try to speak like this, or to pretend like I'm very ladylike. I've always been a bit like tomboyish, or to pretend like my background, my daddy is so and so. No. As soon as I decided to own who I am, to go in with my accent and not put it on, to go in and say, yes, I grew up poor. Yes, I had to teach myself journalism. Yes, I was homeless and stateless for ages. That's when I actually owned and accepted who I was. And when you do, other people will have no choice but to accept you too. And whether or not they have their biases, there is nothing we can do about it. But I decided to use my disadvantages, what I thought were my disadvantages, and turn them into opportunities, to use them to make me different, to help me stand out. Because whether or not they had their biases, when I decided they did, I was like, okay, well then let's use your biases.
That's really important, because I feel like it's so easy to get discouraged by, the discrimination that people receive, especially in this industry, which is already so tough to, put your foot in. So I think it's great to hear that you were very persistent about it, and you decided to take what you were receiving and make it more about you. And I think that's really important.
We have two options in life in general, especially when facing any type of difficulties. We can either be a victim to that scenario. We can either say, I'm a victim, and sit there and feel sorry for ourselves, or we can accept that these obstacles exist and find ways to go around them. Sometimes we can't. And that's why we slightly change our way. But at the same time, on a larger scale, that's why it's important to have the conversations that you and I are having today about diversity. It's important to be able to share these stories. And, it's in life, we like to make things, reduce things to black or white, but things are never black and white. There is all this gray in between. And when things are gray, it's so hard to point them out, especially with these biases. And for as long as we're having these dialogues, for as long as we're speaking, for as long as movements like BLM are happening, then on a larger scale, the conversation will start changing people's perception. The knowledge will hopefully start creating a movement away from those.
I was going to actually ask about the classism that you were talking about, because we've talked to other guests on the show that have mentioned, classism, and how it's very evident in especially theatre and that kind of side of the industry. So it's interesting to hear that it's kind of there in the journalism side as well. Is it a big problem? Would you say, the classism side?
As human beings, classism, sexism, racism has always existed.
Yeah.
I think it's both biological and cultural, but these biases still exist. And I think now it is true that it is a part of our biology to have biases, but then I think it's important to become aware of why we have these biases and challenge ourselves. Because the same way when we moved into that refugee camp and I was scared of the man from Palestine who, looked really scary and had a massive cut on his face, when I was forced to put my biases aside and got to know him and heard his story, he became my uncle. I actually, to this day, think I have more love for that man than for my own uncle that I left back in Iran, And I think it's through listening, hearing each other out, and stop judging each other based on our differences, but start looking for similarities between ourselves. I think that's when we can really tackle that. You can't force it in other people, but I think a lot of the times we can be the change we want to see in the world.
I guess this is another very broad question, but we've been asking all of our guests this, but what do you currently think of MENA representation in the media? Whether that's on the journalism side of things or just generally the media, what do you think about MENA representation at the moment?
To be honest, we don't really see that much of that representation, and it's a shame. I think that's both in front of and behind the camera. In fact, having worked as a freelancer for so many different broadcasters, I've had the privilege of seeing the operations behind the cameras, and you see a lot. Sometimes you actually see more of a representation in front of the camera than behind the camera, because a lot of organizations want to seem like they are giving that opportunity to a lot of people, which isn't necessarily always true, because behind the scenes things are different. The people who actually make the big calls are not of that background, and it's really important to continue having these conversations. I'm so glad that I'm seeing a change in the world, in the conversations, in the media about representing more diverse faces. But I really hope that this isn't just to pretend like change is happening just by bringing a few Black people in. I hope that they're not just trying to say, look, we are doing something, whereas fundamentally they're not. I think diversity should include everybody, not just one or another group, and it should be consistent and all the time, not just now at time-sensitive times when the world is talking. I really wish that we would one day live in a world where we wouldn't need to have a conversation like this, where we wouldn't need to go out and protest outside for the right of any people because of their color of skin. We're all human beings, we're all living in the same society, and we should all be entitled to the same rights. I'm not going to take credit for what I'm about to say, but I'm going to give it completely to the amazing actresses I met when I was making a film for Unreported World's Channel 4, #MeTooBollywood. I went to Mumbai and Kerala in India when #MeToo movement was taking ground, to look at the movement within the Indian film industry. And I discovered whilst there that only less than 1% of women in India's film industry are actually behind the camera. Women were essentially just actresses. And there was a group of Indian actresses who were fed up with the sexism in the industry, with the fact that they were getting paid way less than their male counterparts, the fact that they weren't allowed to really read the script before accepting it, the fact that, as soon as they passed a certain age, they were like put aside, the fact that they didn't have a voice, or they felt like they didn't have any rights, and they were also constantly sexually harassed. And those group decided that these biases exist, they're not going anywhere. And for as long as men were behind the camera, they would be calling the shots. And for as long as women were only actresses, they would be treated that way. And they wanted to change the narrative. So they took control and they decided they created this collective. They brought in all these actors, other actresses, and they decided to teach, learn, and support each other to become directors, producers, and go behind the camera and actually change their narrative by taking charge. As well as having, so what I'm trying to say is, as well as having these conversations, as well as emphasizing on the issues that exist, I think it's also important to actually put ourselves in the positions of authority that can actually change the narrative as well, just like the women are trying to.
I definitely agree with that. I think if we do work, and like you said, we might not necessarily get there through the traditional routes, so we have to accommodate to whatever path comes our way and eventually get to the positions that we are, in sort of higher ranking positions such as yourself, where and hopefully we can sort of help other people up as well once we're in those positions, which is something that I hope we see one day. It's one question that I did want to ask. Now, in journalism, particularly when you're working as, reporting in the situations that you're reporting in, have you this, I mean, I've heard this a lot outside of the journalism industry. I actually haven't heard this from journalists themselves, where a certain picture of the MENA region needs to be painted for it to make it to print. Like it has to only be sort of the disaster news, or it has to be the fact that, everything's basically in turmoil and we hear very little success or, any sort of the good things that are happening in these regions. We hear about, you hear about all the human rights violations and things. And I'm not saying that they don't happen and they don't exist. We know that they do, but we only see that side of the picture. We very rarely see anything positive happening that realizes behind the scenes.
I mean, I see your point, and my own family have often felt frustrated when we say we're Iranian or they say they're Iranian, and non-Iranians are like, ooh, I remember once I had this kid in my school who asked if we ever get grass in Iran, like grass on the floor. It was like, what does Iran look like? I was like, well, sky is blue, grass is green. He goes, you get grass in Iran? Genuinely surprised. So I definitely understand the frustration, but we also need to look at the other side of the story. First of all, there are some programs that, for example, Nat Geo recently did this amazing travel series, where, this father who used to be a soldier went back to all of these countries where he used to serve, including Pakistan, including Iraq, Afghanistan, and they weren't as tourists. And he was like, I used to serve here, but these places are amazing. And there's so many incredibly beautiful places that you don't expect to see in these places. And I found that, like, Afghanistan is my favorite country. It's so gorgeous. And I made a film in Mauritania, in the middle of the desert. I didn't expect it, but I fell in love with this country. The culture, the food, the nature, just out of this world. And yes, there is a frustration that we don't see more of that on TV, but at the same time, making TV is very expensive. And a lot of the documentaries that we see are actually made by news organizations. And news or current affairs is about what's happening in any country. And when, for example, your arm is broken, and you have a cut on this hand, but this arm is broken, you really feel the pain on this arm. And when you go to the doctor, you show them this arm first. So when you go to a country, as beautiful as it may be and as much as it has to offer, if there are major human rights abuses going on, you can't ignore that and go and say, look how pretty this side is. I mean, that does happen. We have travel show stuff. But as a journalist, at least, who wants to help bring solutions, or at least have the showcase the abuses that are going on, if I'm going to a country and I have the opportunity to show the problems, I would so much rather do that. I owe it to the people to do that.
I mean, I agree. I think that's an interesting perspective, and it's one that I probably didn't think about, but it's very true. When you have the opportunity and the platform to talk about, you know, issues that are going on. And, you know, a lot of the projects you've worked on have brought up issues that I didn't even know existed in these countries. For example, one that I really was interested in, it was the mental health one in Afghanistan, and you were showing all these people that were previously in the war, and, you know, it showed how the war affected them and how they've been like chained together in these situations and stuff like that. You know, it's important to show the beauty and the nice side of things, but like the serious side is so much more important. And, you know, when you have the platform like you do, I think I can see why you're passionate about it. I want to show that side. And I'd not thought about that side before, to be honest. I think that's very true.
Honestly, there are so many. It's my dream to be able to one day travel to these countries and show the beauty that I've seen in them, the things that, like you said, we don't necessarily see beyond the headlines, because honestly, especially like countries like Afghanistan, like Pakistan, they're so gorgeous, and you never see this raw beauty, this culture. It's just incredible. And I really wish I had the opportunity, but unfortunately, like I said, these films are incredibly expensive to make, you know, and even like for me to go to Pakistan to make a film, or Afghanistan, I'm risking my life, so we want to minimize the time. So it's incredibly difficult to justify the money and the danger to go there, and, you know, to ignore some of the human rights abuses that are going on and show the other side. But I think it would be so nice to see more of that. But I think a lot of fantastic photographers are out there, and photographers do a great job of that, you know, and we have travel vloggers whose job it is to bring in that side. Whereas with journalism, just like with doctors, I guess, or psychologists, we're always dealing with issues, with problems, with things that we wish that we didn't see in the world. And that's why we focus on them and show them. But I think it's important for viewers to educate themselves. You know, you can't just expect people to sit there and be fed whatever they see. You know, that's where fake news comes in. You can't just sit there and just take whatever you see and just be like, oh, okay, this is it then. You know, people have to be savvy themselves. We now live in a world of information. We have the whole world in our pocket. You know, people should really bother to just like type in and learn a little bit more by literally spending a couple of minutes and looking at a couple of Google or Pinterest photographs of certain countries and educate themselves, because it's so easy to do that.
No, I definitely agree with that. There's very little excuse, but unfortunately it's not a prevailing, it doesn't prevail in society, where you would look up societal culture and you'll take the sound bites that you get through your news, your news or your Facebook, or telling you about the atrocities that are happening in these countries, and you'll build your entire perception of a culture, a country, a people based on those perceptions. And I think that's a global issue. It's not just a Western issue, where I know if I ask some people back home that I know about Africa, or, any other sort of country in the global South, quote unquote, at least, their perception of that would be very reductionist and be based off of what they've just heard or seen off of the news. And there's very little excuse for that.
Exactly. I mean, it's so funny you say that. I remember I was talking to one of my relatives in Iran on the phone, and I used to have a black boyfriend, and when I told her about it, she was like, she gave such a disrespectful reaction. She was kind of like, oh, what, like, words that I don't even want to repeat. And I was like, why do you say that? And she was sort of like excusing her reaction by trying to convince me that perhaps darker people are less superior and, I can do something better. And I said, did you know that, for example, I face exactly the same discrimination that you're giving to this individual in the UK? She was like, what? You? But us Iranians are like, whatever. I was like, I was like, your biases are yours and other people have theirs. And that's why earlier I emphasized on the importance of changing ourselves, challenging our own biases if we want the world to become a better place. It's so easy to point fingers. It's so easy to say, he's racist, he's classist. Every time we're pointing a finger, we're pointing three at ourselves. Are we doing that? And if every single person did that, if we did reflect our own biases, and if we challenged ourselves, if everyone did that, honestly, the world would be such a good place, and we wouldn't need to be having this conversation.
I definitely agree with that. Human empathy is something that I don't think people appreciate enough. If you can create the empathy and put yourself in other people's shoes and realize that you wouldn't like that if that happened to you, and it can flip on you, it doesn't, you never realize that these things could flip on you. I don't think people that were living in Syria in sort of the 2000s, early 2000s would have ever thought they were in the situation that they're in now. And it's like and I can probably apply this to all sorts of scenarios where everyone's really comfortable in their sort of circumstances, and you don't know what it'll take for those circumstances to be flipped back onto you. So no, I think human empathy is definitely something that we need, and to be able to address those biases from within us, and hope for more cohesion and more understanding within society, and then better treatment and kindness, and it feels like it's such a big ask for some reason, even though it shouldn't be.
Yeah, because we like comfort. It's like we like to eat with a spoon and a knife. Oh, sorry, what do I? Some people do. A knife and a fork. That's being ingrained in our head since we were very little. We don't even think about it. It's a part of what we do, right? And if someone suddenly comes and says use chopsticks or use another device to eat, even though it might be a better alternative, even though another person might find that an easier way, we can't. We're like, no, this is how I eat. It's hard, it's challenging, it's out of our comfort zone. And I think with like our biases, like that fork and knife analogy, our biases are the same. They've been ingrained inside of our head before we even had the chance to form them ourselves. When we were just learning and understanding the world around us, they went in here. And the reason it feels like such a big ask to challenge these biases, to challenge these issues, is because change is hard. Change comes out of hardship. And if we want to change something about ourselves, it's difficult. We have to accept we were wrong. We have to go through difficulties and trouble of changing it. It's not easy. And that's why it's hard. But I think when you, just like me and journalism, when I found my passion, when I found the reason big enough to change myself to fit into that mold, I think when we find the reason to want to make that change, whatever it is, whether it's ourselves or anything else, when we find the reason bigger than ourselves, then these difficulties, we won't even see them. They'll come. Just like when we're driving from A to Z, there'll be little traffics or little obstacles on the way that we'll just cross.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't put it any better. And I think, I was going to ask this question as like an ending question, but I think you already touched a lot on it. But if you want, you can, answer it again as a closing kind of question. But what do you think, or what do you want to be seen done in the future in the industry that you're in, or overall in this industry, to ensure better representation?
I want to see better representation. I don't want to see people pretending like they're doing that. I want to see it. I want to see that both in front and behind the camera. I wish we could get to a stage where we wouldn't need to have conversations like this. I wish we get to a stage where people get to different positions that they deserve based on their abilities and their hard work, not based on all the other factors.
I mean, thank you so much. And it's important to have people like you come and talk, and to hear about people like you and your experiences, to hopefully make that change in the future as well. So thank you so much for being here today. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. And I know, Ms. Burr, I'm pretty sure you did as well.
Definitely. It was very motivational, inspirational, full of wisdom. I would definitely say that much. There was a lot of wisdom, a lot of food for thought as well, that I think I would be applying to my own life and circumstances as well. I greatly appreciate it. It was absolutely amazing.
Thank you very much. It was an absolute pleasure to be here. And thank you guys so much for doing this project. And anybody who is taking any step towards creating this conversation to have more diversity I have a lot of admiration for it. And I really thank you. And just before I let you go, there is one thing that I think I should have said before that I didn't really get the chance to. I mean, I have been, despite all the difficulties I've had along the way, and or the biases that have been directed at me, I must say I've actually been incredibly privileged and lucky, and there are so many people who have it so much worse. And it's easy for me to sit down here and say everything that I just said, but I know that there are so many people who have and are having it really, really difficult. And when I say we need to try to overcome them, we need to own who we are and focus on what we can do, I by no means mean to reduce the difficulties that I know a lot of people are facing, and a lot of discrimination that people who may look, sound a lot more different than I do to a lot of people who would have discriminations.
Of course, of course. I mean, that's so true. And again, I think it's important to talk about these things and do what you said as well, but to take action, and have a platform to talk about what's happening in the world, like you are doing. So yeah, thank you so much for being here again.
Thank you
Really,
very
really
much.
appreciate it. Thank you.